Hi and welcome back to my channel. I hope you are all doing good and that you have recovered from last week's case where we talked about Megan Meyer and how her neighbor bullied her to the point where she took her own life. Today's case takes us to the UK's youngest murderer in history. The trigger warnings of today's case are sexual abuse of a minor, neglect, domestic abuse and the murder of a child. So without any further ado, let's get on to the video. Mary Flora Bell was born in Newcastle, England on the 26th of May in 1957 to her mother Betty Bell. Betty was working as a sex worker and she was only 17 years old at the time when she got her daughter. And it's said that the first words that Betty said to her daughter were, "Get this thing away from me." Now, it's not known who the father of Mary is, but her mother Betty got married just a few years after giving birth to her daughter to a man called Billy Bell, and he kind of took on the role of a father figure for Mary. Now, Billy was already involved in criminal activity and he also had an alcohol problem. Billy, Betty and Mary lived in a pretty bad neighborhood. Besides the fact that the place was always dirty, the location was known to be a high criminal area. And because there was so much sex work, drug activity and also domestic violence present, the police would show up almost daily. Despite the highly dangerous neighborhood, Mary, just like the other kids, would be just outside and playing. They were children who were just barely 2 years old and they would all be outside just playing unsupervised. And the kids would be playing until very late in the night. Betty was usually working in the night and she specialized in BDSM. And just a quick explanation of what BDSM is. BDSM is a kink where one part takes pleasure in giving and receiving pain and degradation. So Betty was practicing BDSM where she would be whipping and strangling the customers on their wishes. And it's said that once married and 4 years old, her mother Betty would rent her daughter out for her to be sexually abused. Betty was struggling with her mental health. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and for those of you who don't know what bipolar disorder is, it is also known as manic depression, which causes extreme mood swings. So you experience extreme highs, but also extreme lows. Betty was also addicted to alcohol. Now, as for Mary, she was a bedwetter, and she was terrified to go to bed at night, because when she did wet the bed, Betty would explode at her. Betty would grab Mary by her head and she would rub her face into the mattress where she had just peed. Betty would even go as far as to hang the mattress out in the front yard for everyone to see. It is also said that Betty tried to kill her daughter on many occasions. Betty's family would later come out and actually report about the many times that Mary had an accident. Betty at one point had told them that Mary had accidentally swallowed a bunch of sleeping pills and obviously got very sick afterwards. Mary at one point actually needed to be hospitalized where doctors needed to pump her stomach. And when asked what happened, Mary just told them that Betty had gave her Smarties. There was even one occasion where Mary fell out of a 2-story window. Apparently Betty had tried to choke her daughter Mary out on numerous occasions and even gave her away to a woman that she had met at an adoption clinic. This woman, for some reason, wasn't allowed to adopt the child, so Betty just pushed Mary into her arms and said, "Here, you can have her." Betty was trying everything that she could come up with to get rid of her daughter. She did not want her, and she made that very clear. Thankfully, Betty's sister Isa was following them, because obviously the family didn't really trust Betty with her daughter. So Isa followed this woman who now had married to her home. And once she knew where this woman lived, she immediately told her parents what had happened, and they obviously were outraged. They confronted Betty right away and told her, "Listen, if you don't get this child back within the next 2 hours, we are going to call the police on you." So Betty, not really willingly, went and got Mary back. And the woman that had Mary was a very kind-hearted person. This woman had purchased new clothes for Mary and allowed Betty to take everything that she had just bought. For the first 6 years, Mary was more with her aunt and uncle than she was with her own mother. Betty pretty much just passed Mary off to friends and family whenever she could. And her aunt and uncle even tried to adopt her at one point, but Betty wouldn't allow that. Which to me just makes no sense. You had no problem giving your daughter to a complete stranger, but yet you refuse to let your own family adopt your child that you try so hard to get rid of. Betty made it very clear that she didn't want her daughter, but yet she always came back for Mary. This whole dynamic led to Mary becoming very cold and distant. She had a hard time making friends. She did have a friend who was a 5-year-old girl, but unfortunately this girl was struck by a bus and died instantly. And to make things even worse, Mary saw the whole thing happening because she and this girl were playing outside of their home. Mary started to develop an even more concerning pattern, to the point where the other children were afraid of her. She was a notorious liar, and she also had mood swings where she would be happy and everything was good, and the next moment she would be on you, hitting you, biting you, scratching you. So the other kids didn't really want anything to do with her. Mary did have one friend though, and her name was Norma Bell. And despite that the girls shared a last name, they were not related to one another. Norma was 2 years older than Mary, but Mary was still kind of the leader of the two. Whatever Mary told Norma to do, she would do it. On the 11th of May in 1968, Mary and Nora were on their way to a store to get them some sweets. And on their way there, they decided to take their 3-year-old neighbor called John with them. About an hour later, the girls returned with John, who was now bleeding from his head. And when asked what happened, Mary told the officers and the ambulance that her and Norma had found him near some old sheds, where they assumed that he had been playing and apparently fell down. It is later found out that it was indeed Mary who had pushed him. John did, however, manage to make a full recovery. The next day, on the 12th of May, there were 3 girls: 7-year-old Pauline, 6-year-old Susan, and 6-year-old Cindy. Now, the 3 girls were playing in the sand pit of the daycare, where Mary just suddenly snapped and started to choke 7-year-old Pauline. Norma was holding her down while Mary was on top of her, choking her and also putting sand in the girl's mouth. She even tried to shove her fingers down her throat. The escalation seemed to have taken Norma by surprise, because she did let go of Pauline, who managed to struggle herself free and then ran home. But Mary wasn't done yet. She went up to Susan and Cindy and started to choke Cindy. And Mary choked her so hard that there were visible fingerprints on the girl's neck. Pauline's mom, upon hearing this, immediately called the police. But unfortunately, nothing was done, and so Mary just continued to escalate even more. There was also a boy called Martin Brown in the neighborhood, and he was kind of described as a mischievous kid. He did cause trouble here and there, but all in all, he was a pretty happy kid who was always smiling and seemed to be liked by the neighbors. Martin lived with his mother June, his father Georgie, and his little sister Linda. And on the 25th of May is where the tragic events of today's case take place. It was a Saturday, and Martin woke up before everybody else. He sneaked himself some cookies and milk, and around 9 p.m. he woke up his parents so they could enjoy some breakfast together. Martin later on the day went over to his aunt to ask her if she had some money because he wanted to go and buy himself a lollipop. His aunt gave him the money, and around 3:15 p.m. Martin went over to a shop called Dixon to get himself the lollipop. Now, this area had a lot of abandoned houses, some of which were planned to be torn down. There were 3 boys who were just strolling around that area, and they decided to enter one of the houses to see if there was some scrap wood. The boys went up to the 2nd floor, and that's when they noticed Martin Brown's body laying there on his back and his arms stretched out. There was blood coming out of his head. Down the road, there were some workers who were already getting started, and those boys, upon seeing Martin laying there, just started screaming bloody murder. One of the workers heard the boy screaming and decided to go and check it out. And once he saw the scene, he immediately called the ambulance. And the ambulance arrived at 3:35 p.m. They tried to give him CPR, but unfortunately it was too late. Martin Brown had lost his life. There were no obvious signs of any struggles or injuries. There was a bottle of aspirins laying next to Martin's body, so the paramedics thought that maybe Martin had just mistook them as candy and just swallowed them. An autopsy was done, but the cause of death couldn't be figured out, so the police assumed that maybe natural death was the cause. Martin Brown was 4 years old at the time of his passing. There was also a theory that maybe Martin was climbing up something and he slipped, and that's how he died. On the 26th of May, so the next day, it was Mary Bell's birthday. She had just turned 11 years old. It was at Norma's house. Now, when Norma's father came in to check up on the girls, he saw Mary on top of Norma's little sister. He immediately rushed over to them and pulled them apart, but he thought that the girls were just roughhousing and he told them to quit it. One day after Mary's birthday, the police was called because someone had broken into a nursery. The police went over to the scene to check it out, just to find out that nothing was stolen. Whoever had broken into the nursery seemed to have just vandalized it. But on a closer look, the police did find 4 notes which said, "We did murder Martin Brown. F off, you bastard. I murder so that I may come back. F off, we murder. Watch out, Fanny." The police noticed immediately that there were a lot of slurs. But they also realized that there were a lot of spelling mistakes, as well as the handwriting just looked a lot like child's writing. But since Martin Brown's case was ruled as an accident, the police didn't take the notes all too serious. To them, this seemed like a bad joke played by some kids that didn't quite get the seriousness of it. After a few weeks of Martin's passing, Mary would visit his mother June almost daily, and she would almost terrorize this woman. Mary would always ask June how she was, if she was crying over Martin's death, if she missed him. And she would be smiling and giggling while asking her that. She would even ask if she could see Martin, and to June this was an 11-year-old girl. So she tried her best to explain to Mary that she couldn't see Martin because he was no longer here. And Mary just blankly stared at June and said, "Yeah, I know he's dead. I'm asking to see the coffin." And she had the biggest smile on her face while uttering those words to June, who just stood there in complete shock. So fast forward to 9 months later, on the 31st of July, a 3-year-old boy called Brian Howie went missing. Brian was outside playing with his dog, and as dinner approached, his parents started to call for him and went outside, but Martin was nowhere to be found. Of course, panic set immediately. The parents started to search for their missing son, and soon the other neighbors would join in the search party. Among them were also Norma and Mary. And Mary almost seemed too happy to be looking for a missing child. She was singing and skipping, but after a while, with no sign of Brian, the police was called. And at 11:10 p.m. the police did find the body of Brian Howie near his house. He was covered in green and purple marks all over his body. And he also had stretch marks on his neck and also all over his face. So to the police, this was a clear case of homicide. Detective Chief Constable James Dawson was the leader of the case. He was also at the scene when Martin's body was found, and the detective immediately saw the similarities between the 2 boys. Another autopsy was done, and it showed that the cause for Brian's death was caused by strangulation somewhere around 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. It also seemed that he had his nose pitched shut and that his genitalia had been cut, but those were only superficial wounds, only puncturing the skin. His hair had been cut off, and in his stomach he had the letter M carved in. Now, to the police officers, it was clear that the predator wasn't an adult. By the looks of it, an adult would have used way more force and strength in strangling Brian. So the police had this terrible feeling that it must have been a child who did it. So the investigation had started, and within the first 24 hours, over 1,200 children were interviewed. And of course, Mary and Norma were also being questioned by the police. In fact, the 2 girls had to be interviewed multiple times because they kept changing their answers, and they would also continue to laugh and joke around the whole time. Mary told the officers that she had seen an 8-year-old boy standing on the road with Brian, and that this 8-year-old boy just happened to beat Brian around the head and the face. Mary also proceeded to tell the officers that she had seen a silver-colored pair of scissors, but that those scissors were kind of damaged. So basically, she described the same scissors that were found next to Brian. But the police hadn't made it official. They didn't take any photos of it, and media also didn't get a hold of this information, meaning only the police and the killer knew about the scissors. Nonetheless, the police did take a look at this 8-year-old boy that Mary described, only for them to find out that this boy at the time of the murder was with his family at the airport. And by the time pretty much everyone was eliminated, besides Mary and Norma. And now after Mary had mentioned the scissors, she looked even more suspicious. On the 4th of August, Norma was interviewed again. She had told the officers that she had been playing with her siblings from 2 till 5 p.m. But the other neighborhood kids came forward and said that they had seen her with Mary. So the detectives confront Norma about these informations, and she changes her story yet again. She tells them that she was with Mary and that Mary took her to meet up with Brian. Now, upon hearing this, Norma was immediately taken to the police station where she came clean about everything. She told the police that Mary took her to see Brian, but that he was already dead once she got here, and that Mary confessed to her that she killed Brian by squeezing his neck and also pushing up his lungs. According to Norma, Mary said that she enjoyed killing Brian, and she also showed her a razor which she then hid under a block. The police took Norma back to the crime place, where she proceeded to point to the concrete block, which indeed had a razor hid under it. Norma was then taken back to the police station to give an official statement. On the 5th of August, Mary was brought in for questioning, and she was very angry that Norma had confessed. And once Mary realized that Norma had also shown the police the razor, she actually threatened to kill Norma as well. But despite the threats, the police didn't actually have any solid evidence against Mary, and for all they knew, it could be also Norma who tried to put the blame on her. So they let Mary go. On the 7th of August, Brian Howie's funeral took place, and Detective Dobson went there to try and get a look of the people, see if someone was acting strange or something. And that's when, according to him, he knew that Mary was guilty. Mary was standing in front of Brian's house, and once the casket was brought out, she was smiling and laughing and rubbing her hands together. And Detective Dobson arrested Mary on the same afternoon. Mary immediately started to deny everything, saying it was Norma who was responsible for Brian's death. That she even started to strangle Mary, and that it was Mary who tried to stop her, but that Norma started to scream at Mary, and that she threw Brian against the wall head first, and that that's how he died. Detective Dobson confronted Mary about Martin Brown's death as well. And Mary admitted to it, but again placed the blame on Norma, saying that it was her who broke into the nursery and wrote those notes. By 8 p.m., Mary Bell was arrested for the murder of Brian Howie, and approximately about 30 minutes later, Norma Bell was also arrested for the murder of Brian Howie. On the 21st of August, the investigation regarding Martin Brown's case was closed, and the officers called the school of Mary and Norma to get some of the girls' books, to be able to compare their handwriting to the notes that were found. Mary even wrote about the death of Martin in one of her books, where she drew a picture of a dead boy and a pill bottle next to him. But again, this information hasn't been public. There were also fibers of the dresses of the two girls on Martin as well as Brian. So both of the girls were charged with 2 murders. The trial took place on the 5th of December in 1968 at Newcastle Assassins, and the trial was a mess to say the least. Betty, Mary's mother, was constantly interrupting by sobbing very loudly. She even stormed out of the courtroom at one point just to make a dramatic reappearance. Norma, on the other hand, had 10 more siblings, so her family reacted way more empathetic to her, and she also reacted way more childlike to the evidence. Norma was crying, and she was scared for a 13-year-old girl to be put in court. But Mary, on the other hand, showed no emotion. In fact, Mary was very sarcastic, and she would also give very snappy comments when asked a question. Mary was examined by a few psychiatrists, where all of them diagnosed her with psychopathic tendencies.
Just a quick edit here. Unfortunately, my camera died here, and I didn't notice this part was not probably recording. So enjoy the still image of me where we talk about Norma. On the 14th of December, Norma Bell was found not guilty on the grounds that Norma was manipulated by Mary into committing the crimes with her. And the fact that Norma was so single-minded and had a childlike behavior that she wasn't able to understand the aftermath of what they were doing.
Mary Bell was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility due to the fact that she was showing classic symptoms of psychopathy. The judge actually described Mary as very dangerous to the children around her. And because of the fact that Mary was only 11 years old at the time of the crime, the court was unsure of where to put her. The mental facilities weren't fully developed to take her, and she was far too dangerous to be put in a program for troubled kids, so the court decided that Mary would be put into a reform school at Red Bank Special Unit in St. Helens, Lancashire. Now this school was at first only just for boys, but was changed to allow girls only for Mary. It is said that her mother Betty came to visit Mary on regular occasions, and that Mary would be excited to see her mom, but after Betty would leave, Mary would just explode into a fit of rage. Betty also took the change and profited from her daughter by selling her story to the tabloids. And Betty would also talk Mary into writing letters and poems that she would sell to the press. Mary managed to get paid around £5,000 for telling the story of how she murdered 2 young boys. Mary also kept putting the blame on her mother Betty for how she turned out. She even wrote to her mother begging her to go to the judge and the jury to tell them that it was all her fault. In 1970, Mary actually confessed to a consoler that she was sexually abused as a child by a housemaster, but her confession just was put under not believable for some sort of reason. Once Mary turned 16 years old, she was transferred to Moore Court Open Prison. The prisoners there are trusted to complete their sentence with minimal supervision. They also have the chance to take an employment while still serving their sentence in order for them to make some money. In 1977, when Mary was just 20 years old, she escaped prison to go and hook up with a guy. I couldn't find out anything about this guy, so I have no idea who he was or how they met. But she was found pretty quickly, and her punishment was 28 days without any privileges. And in 1980, at the age of 23, Mary was released from prison. And she was even granted anonymity for her to be able to get a fresh start in life. On the 25th of May in 1984, 16 years after the murder of Martin Brown, Mary gave birth to her daughter, who was also granted anonymity until her 18th birthday. Once Mary's daughter turned 14 years old, people realized who she was, and so Mary went back to court to fight lifelong anonymity for her daughter, which she was granted. And in 2001, Mary, at the age of 51, became a granddaughter. And this granddaughter was also granted lifelong anonymity. And that's it for today's case. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave me a like and a comment on which case you would like to see me cover next. I hope I see you all in the next time. Take care. Bye.